Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, a circle cutting jig for your handheld router. So I know what you're thinking, and you're thinking, come on Kenny, we just did a circle cutting jig for your handheld router, and that would be true. We did a jig not too long ago that utilized the accessory ports on your router base. But I got to thinking, what if your router doesn't have those ports, and what if you don't have those to utilize? How can you get a circle cutting jig for your router? And that's what today's show is about. So the first thing we're going to do is get our router, and we're going to get a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. Well, I've chosen the router that I want to make this for, and it will be my DeWalt fixed base. And our base plate here is 6 inches in diameter. So you're going to want to measure yours and see how big it is. And then draw a center line on your plywood at that mark. That is a 6-inch base. We want a center line that's 3 inches. So at the 3-inch mark here, we're going to draw a line all the way along. The plywood that we're going to be using is 3/4 of an inch thick. The length really doesn't matter. All you really need to know about the length is that depending on how big of a circle you want to make, this is your radius. And we're going to take our router base plate, and we're just going to lay it on here and line it up. And when we do, we're going to line it up with the edge of the board. We're going to trace around our entire base plate. Now down at this end of the jig, from your center line, we're going to measure out 1.5 inches out from either side. And once we get those marks laid in place, we're going to join these marks here with the outside edges of the tracing of our circular router base. Well, now that we've come this far, we're going to take this over to the table saw, and we're going to cut off this 6-inch strip. And just before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we're going to transfer our center line just onto one end of our board. You now want to remove your plastic base from your router. We need it to mark out our mounting holes, so we will remove it and then place it on your plywood where you traced out your base of your router. Well, I'm just using a thread ID kit to see what the threads are in the base of this router plate. And the threads here are an 832. So I'll go through my bolt supply and get 4 832 bolts, because we will be mounting our router onto this base eventually, and we're going to need holes to be able to drill it. The original screws are way too short, so we will have to replace them. So we're going to drill and countersink these holes to accommodate the new bolts for the router plate. And now that we're done our test fit and we're happy with the way that everything fits together here on the base and the jig, we need to mark the center of our router, and that will be to allow us to get the bit down through our jig, which would kind of be helpful, don't you think? So what we're going to do is right in the center, we're going to mark it very carefully, just as we have with everything else here, and we're going to drill 1.5 inches through hole right in the center of this base. And now, although you don't have to, I would like to soften up the edges of this 1.5 inch hole. I'm just going to use a 1/8 inch round over and just clean it up a bit. We now want to route a 1/4 inch through groove all the way from about 1 inch in from this tail end all the way up to just outside of our circle for our router base. So all I've got done is I have a start mark marked here on the fence. I've got a stop mark here on the fence. I'm going to line it up with a start mark, lower it down onto a spinning bit, run it all the way through until I hit my stop mark, shut the router off, wait till it stops completely, and then lift it off. We're going to raise the bit a little more and then repeat the process. You don't want to take it all in one shot too hard on the bit. Do it in passes. I'll probably do 3 passes to get the entire groove through. All right, so your groove is cut. Don't move anything. Don't move your fence. Don't move anything. Leave it exactly like it is, including your stop-start mark. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take this 1/4 inch diameter bit out of here and we're going to install a 5/8 inch diameter bit. And what we want to do is exactly in the center, like what we've done here. We want to place another groove right over top of this 1/4 inch one on the bottom of the jig, so on the same side as our countersinks. We want to place a 5/8 diameter groove all the way along over top of this 1/8 of an inch deep, and that will house one of these T-nuts. So here is our 1 inch by 1/4 inch T-nut, and that now just sits in that slot, and we will have a jig knob on the top with a washer that will be able to lock down and keep this here wherever we set it along our track. But for now, we are pretty much done with this section of the build. So the only thing left to do with this is we're going to take this over to the scroll saw and we are going to cut this around our lines with the perimeter. We're going to sand it up to the line. I'm going to do a 1/8 inch profile around the edges, and then I'll come back and see you and we'll carry on with how to get this here as your center pin. Now that everything is sanded and cleaned up, we can mount our base to our jig. And that, boys and girls, is pretty much your jig done as far as the woodworking aspect goes anyway. But what about this guy? What do we do with this? Well, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do. Basically, we're going to mount this into a block of wood. We're going to drill a 3/4 hole, or even tighter if we can. We need to get that completely tight in that block of wood. The crosshairs, or the center of the drilling of this block, we're going to use a fence on the drill press. Nothing is going to get moved so that we can repeat that center drilling in the block. And once we get our T-bolt mounted in there and secured, we're going to drill a hole right down through the center of the bolt. Now, it's not going to be a deep hole. It's going to be just enough to glue in a common nail. Now, I can't tell you what size to drill because your nail may not be the same size as mine. But you don't need a big honking 2-inch finishing nail. You just need a little itty bitty, like 1-inch common nail, just a pivot point pin. So as you can see here on these side videos, it's really not that big of a deal. And then when you're done, just put a little bit of epoxy on that thing and push it into the hole and let the epoxy set up so that the pin is now glued into the base of your bolt. And with that, we're just going to place our T-bolt up inside our slot here. The wider track, the 5/8 of an inch track that we ran, is going to allow the head of that T-bolt to travel in there, and we can lock it down with our set knob. And if we flip it over, you can see how that fits into that groove, and our pin is centered along that groove. So this is it for the jig, guys, but the question is, how do you use it? Well, a jig like this will produce anything from a 6-inch circle at its smallest setting right up to a 42-inch diameter circle at its largest setting. Well, the first step you want is you want to set your pin, and for that you just have to loosen your jig knob and slide it along, measuring from the cutter's edge to the center of your pivot pin. Now that you have that set up, you want to place your router in the base that is mounted here on your jig. Install a straight bit of your choice. I have a 1/4-inch bit here. If you want, you can use larger. It's up to you. The diameter really doesn't matter. What matters is your measurement between the two. And now that we have it set up, we need to get our stock. I've got my stock that I want to cut my circle out of, and I'm going to mark the center just by drawing a line from corner to corner. And once I get the center marked on our stock, which in this case is just 1/4-inch MDF, but once I get the center marked, using a compass, I'm going to set it up to mark the same diameter as our circle. And using our center point, I'm going to draw our circle onto our board. You now want to drill a hole in the center that coincides with the same diameter of nail that you used for your pivot pin. The next hole that you want to drill will be a hole that is larger than the diameter of the router bit that you'll be using to cut the circle, and the edge of that drilled hole is going to be right on the edge of your marked circle circumference here, or your outer line. So this is all the setup that we need to do other than securing our stock to a scrap piece. So I have our scrap piece connected to our bench, and I'm going to use some double-sided tape, and I'm going to put one piece in the middle to hold our circle, and I'm going to put a couple smaller pieces on the offcuts on the outside. That way when it lets go, this thing isn't going all over the place. So let's attach that, and don't forget to put some light clamp pressure on it to help that double-sided tape really adhere. Well, the next step that you want to do now that everything is taped in place and secure is you want to line up your pin with your hole that you drilled in the center and sit your jig on top of it, being sure that that 1/4-inch bit falls into that larger hole that we drilled to accommodate it. Well, our next step is basically to turn the router on and rotate your jig one full 360-degree rotation. Once you get the first pass done, you're going to want to start up the router again, lower the bit down while it's spinning into that 1/2-inch hole that you drilled to accommodate it, and once you get it low enough that you want, do another pass. And then just repeat the process until your circle is fully cut. And after a few passes, you should have gone through your board here to cut your circle. So if we just break away the double-sided tape here, just give it a little pull, just like that. And there we have it, a perfectly cut circle using your router. And there you have it, a circle cutting jig for your handheld router. Guys, I know we've done this on the show before, when we use the threaded rod and utilize the existing accessory ports on your router base. And although my router base that I use today does have those accessory ports, I wanted to show you that there's another way to make the jig. There's several great things about this particular jig that I've shown you today. One is it doesn't take much material. A little bit of plywood, a 1/4-inch T-bolt, and an existing router that you already have. If you don't have the jig knobs, make a shop-made one. They're not that difficult to make, and modify a 1/4 bolt to suit your needs. There's a way around it. Modify the jig to suit your purposes. Heck, if you don't mind a 1/4-inch hole in the center of your circle, Instead of using that pin and drilling out the center of a T-bolt, why not use the 1/4-inch bolt with a washer underneath to be your pivot point? That's up to you. I prefer a smaller pin for that. Guys, there's another great thing about this jig, which is no matter what router you own, whether it's a trim router or a full size, whether it's a plunge or a fixed base, it doesn't matter if it's DeWalt, a Bosch, it makes no difference. It will fit and work with no matter what router you have, and that makes it absolutely awesome. I mean, if you don't have the router accessories ports for the threaded rod one that I showed you a while back, then this one is right up your alley, and you need to stop saying, I'll make one later, and just get in your shop and make one. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this week's show. I hope you've enjoyed the build. Honestly, I hope that this is the router circle that you have, or circle cutter that you have been looking for. I hope you're going to try it. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in this week, and I hope you're going to join me next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.